run cattle up in Victoria's high country, Tongariro country, just under Mount Buffalo on the eastern fall there of Mount Buffalo. Beautiful high rainfall foothills country, and our operation is all about storing carbon in the ecosystem, both in trees and in soil. So very passionate about this area. We don't quite have the scale to launch into a carbon farming project per se, but I like to think of ourselves as carbon farmers. So that's a bit of context about what we do. And in my role with RCS, I spend a lot of time working with people who have soil carbon projects. So that's a registered soil carbon project. And that'll begin to make sense in a little bit. But that's where the kind of expertise and understanding comes from of the carbon farming sector more broadly. And we work with a soil carbon project developer called CarbonLink. So I'll just acknowledge that some of the data when it comes to soil carbon comes from CarbonLink. If you want to dig into that a little bit later on in the discussion, we absolutely can. So today we're going to talk about the carbon cycle, the global carbon cycle. What's an ACCU? And for people that are fairly familiar with the carbon farming space, we might be doubling up a bit there, but hopefully I can add some colour to it. And then we're going to talk about 3 carbon farming initiatives which are broadly relevant to the parts of the world where we're farming, and then a little bit of a deeper dive on soil carbon and how it might work. So that's where we're headed. And this is a disclaimer that there's a fair bit of jargon in this world. So apologies if I do start using acronyms and you need me to stop. Just sing out and say, "Hey, Don, what does that mean?" Anyhow, photosynthesis. So we begin today with some, I think it's year 3, year 4, primary school science. Looking at the wonderful system that is photosynthesis. And really, I like to think about this as the kind of lungs of the planet. And so as plants photosynthesize, they combine carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to create sugars. And a lot of those sugars are then exchanged with the soil system in the form of root exudates. And this is just a wonderful world of symbiosis that I spend a lot of time thinking about and a lot of time excited about. But really simply, photosynthesis is kind of the only system that we've got today to deal with past, present, and future emissions. There's a lot of speculation about what carbon capture and storage might look like and different ways that we can drill carbon dioxide down into the Earth's core, but all that's pretty scary. So I'm more interested in focusing on what we do know that works, and we know that plants are very good at photosynthesizing and capturing CO2 and converting it into cellulose and lignin and all of their wonderful products. So through photosynthesis we can not only offset future emissions but also deal with some of the historic emissions. As we probably know, carbon is a form of energy. And I do like to think about this in terms of energy cycles, because carbon is the center of our ecological systems or our ecological cycles. It's really that central kind of nucleus of everything that we do. It's the beginning and end of all life, which is a wonderful quote from Albert Howard, who was a pioneer of the organic farming movement in, I think, the late or early 18th century. So we're about 18% carbon, which is where that ashes to ashes, dust to dust concept comes from. So we're all part of this global carbon cycle. It's not separate to us. We're actually involved as ecological beings, and also we're obviously involved in the fossil fuel cycle and the carbon emissions associated with that. But I just wanted to quickly make a note here, because there is a distinction between the biogenic carbon cycle, which is, as we talked about, plants and soils breathing in and out. In other words, kind of the Earth system, and then the fossil carbon cycle, which comes from the burning of old evolved fossil carbon. So those two things are slightly different. And I might be getting into contentious territory there, but that's just my take. And we'll be focusing mostly on that biogenic carbon cycle today. So there's an emissions component to where we're headed, but really I'm interested in this 380 odd million year old cycle here that is powered on the one side by photosynthesis, and on the other side we have this loss or oxidation. And sequestration is just the fancy word for what's left in the middle after that process. Sequestration, or to sequester, is actually kind of to kidnap. So one thing you think about is we're just kidnapping carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it away in biomass or in soils. So yeah, it's really that cyclical cycle of birth, growth, reproduction on the one side, so production broadly, and then death and decay on the other side, so loss. And what's left over, that chunk that we're trying to hang on to if we're going to be involved in a carbon farming project, is nature's very sophisticated way of storing carbon. There's a lot of really complex science that sits behind sequestration, particularly as it refers to soils and how much carbon we can store in soils and what are the limitations of storing carbon in soils. But that's probably a whole webinar, really. So maybe we can do that another time. But today we'll just go at the surface level and say that sequestration is what's left over. And in kind of global terms, these are some really big numbers that I find it fun to think about. Bit of a nerd like that. So in the atmosphere, we've got about 800 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent in the atmosphere. In all of the plant biomass, so think about the Amazon rainforest, the beautiful old growth forest that we have here in Victoria, and yeah, just all of the trees and woody biomass, that's 550 billion tonnes. And then the soil is about these two put together again, which is pretty cool. So we've got 2,300 billion tonnes of carbon stored in the soil. So it's a fairly big and significant sink. And that's where the opportunity is to continue adding to that sink and putting back some of the carbon that we've let out of that soil sink through our historic agricultural practices. Just a quick aside on that. I think a lot of the really interesting historical work thinking about the Australian landscape and how much carbon has been, I guess, lost to the atmosphere through our post-colonisation farming practices in some areas of the kind of grassy woodlands that run up along the eastern side of the Great Dividing Range. It's estimated that soil organic matter was probably in the zone of about 10 to 20%. And I think for all of us that are familiar with seeing soil tests, it's pretty rare to see a 10 or 20% soil organic matter in an Australian farming system. In fact, most tests that I see are sitting around that 1 or 2%. So it just gives you an idea of how much has been lost through our farming practices, and an opportunity there to think about what we can put back. Then the oceans have been a huge sink and have dealt with the vast majority of historic emissions. So be very grateful to those beautiful krill in Antarctica who are doing a lot of storage of carbon for us. Our emissions globally at the moment are 41 gigatons and climbing. So that's the obligation that we have globally to kind of deal with that. And just on the left-hand side here, this is a cool video from the early 2000s that I like. If you're interested, look it up. It's a time lapse of the global carbon cycle by NASA. And what you can see is that idea of the Earth kind of inhaling and exhaling. So you've got the Northern Hemisphere's boreal forests going into autumn and winter, and you can see the CO2 skyrocket as the trees lose all their leaves, and then as the trees come into spring and summer and begin photosynthesizing again, you've got all that carbon dioxide sucked back out of the atmosphere. So it's just a cool visual of how the carbon cycle works on a kind of annual and seasonal basis. So what the heck's an ACCU? It's a fancy word for saying it's the equivalent of 1 tonne of CO2, or you might hear it referred to as a CO2e. In Australia, we've got a carrot policy. So you might have seen that in the EU, particularly, there's different regulatory approaches to incentivising emissions reduction. The Australian legislature has taken a proactive approach or a positive approach to give us the opportunity to benefit, I suppose, from carbon farming initiatives and generate these ACCUs. So an ACCU, or 1 ACCU, is the equivalent of 1 tonne of carbon dioxide. And we will, as we'll see in a minute, there are sort of different values that get associated with different types of ACCUs from different types of carbon projects. But if you want to, I'm quite a visual person, so I like to think about, well, what the heck's a tonne of CO2? So a tonne of CO2 is about 500 IBCs full of carbon dioxide. So each one of those IBCs full up to halfway is a kilo. So 500 of them would be a tonne of CO2. And if you want to think about, gas exchange and the difference between a gas and a solid, a tonne of soil carbon is about 1 of those IBCs full. So where have we come from? This is kind of the global framework working its way down to the local context. We've got the Paris Agreement, which set the emissions reduction targets, and then Australia's response to that has been the establishment of the ACCU scheme. And under that, we have these carbon project methods, and we can generate ACCUs by entering into a carbon project under one of those methodologies. All of this is regulated by a government body called the Clean Energy Regulator, and they determine and administer the methods and then also issue the carbon credits once we are lucky enough to produce one. And once we do that, there's 3 options really broadly. We can trade them, so that would be selling them into the carbon market. We can hold on to them, so we can hold on to them either for our own use or speculating that maybe they'll go up in value. It's kind of like that Kenny Rogers song, The Gambler. You've got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. Or we can retire them. So you can use them in your supply chain, and this is where things get a little bit tangled. And we'll get into insetting and offsetting in a bit, but you can retire them, which is essentially saying like this carbon is set aside for the emissions that are occurring in the broader supply chain. Today's market, what are they worth? About $35 is what's called the spot price. But as you can see, soil carbon has a spread from $37 to $50, and forestry is $37 to $42, and environmental plantings, which are the 3 that we're going to talk about today, is $47 to $65. So there are carbon credit units that are considered high quality, and the ones that we're going to talk about today are all considered high quality. Probably not great to speculate too much about what future prices will be, but out of curiosity, I did some digging, and this is a Ernst & Young report from 2023, which suggests that between by 2035, carbon credits will be worth somewhere in the realm of $75 or in the range of $65 to $125. So fairly valuable unit, and projections are somewhat useful and sometimes dangerous, but definitely projections that I've seen are seeing the value of these credits go up as we approach 2035.
Don?
Yeah, I might just pull up there.
What are SGMs, just on that last slide?
Where are you, Christy?
Down the bottom. What we do know is that the longer SGM facilities delay abatement, the more rapidly prices will arise.
Yeah, so you would have heard of the safeguard mechanism. Yeah, so the safeguard mechanism is basically a policy that is targeting the top 200 emitters, and they have an obligation to reduce or offset their emissions by a certain chunk. And in large part that mechanism which is coming into effect this year for a big chunk of emitters is driving the demand. So on the demand side, you've got all these emitters who are very suddenly having to deal with a big chunk of emissions. And so there's a huge supply gap at the moment in terms of ACCUs that can be bought and the emitters that need to buy them. Does that
Right, thank you.
answer the question? Are there any other questions before we move on?
I'm just asking, is everyone experiencing difficulty with presenters' audio? I'm not. Is anyone else? Sorry, Chris, it might be you.
Apologies. Hopefully it begins to work. But Christy, if it is breaking up, please sing out and let me know. So carbon farming, where do we fit in? As you'd all be aware, the farms are living in dynamic landscapes, and really what we're doing is actually trying to increase that liveliness and dynamism of the landscapes through putting more carbon back into that system. So if you go back to where we started today, carbon is that kind of central energy node of all life systems, but particularly all agricultural systems, which are life systems. So if we wanted to enter in a carbon farming initiative, we need to generate what's called additional carbon. So this idea of additionality is very important. And it basically means that the carbon that we're storing is new or additional to what we were already going to do. So when it comes to a plantation, it needs to be that was previously cleared, and we're showing that by putting it back to plantation, we're actually storing new carbon, taking it out of the atmosphere and storing it in woody biomass. Same for reforestation and the same for soil carbon. Then we've got to deal with our baseline emissions, and I'll get into that in more detail in a second. But importantly, we've got to do due diligence. So we have to, if we're entering into a long-term business partnership with a service provider, or if we're taking on the responsibilities and obligations of a carbon project ourselves, we need to be sure that we're going into it with eyes wide open and that we understand the rules of the game. And that's kind of where I spend a lot of time, is assisting landholders to, understand what's the broader context for going into a carbon farming project, and where does it fit in your operation, and what are the risks and how are we going to manage them. So due diligence, hugely important. And if you're working with a carbon developer, it's important that you begin to ask some serious questions about what their due diligence process is and how risks are managed. That's just my free advice to everyone. Emissions accounting, this is a little diagram from ACCU, so thank you for this one. Pinched it off your very wonderful resources. But effectively, what we're doing is we're measuring our emissions in the baseline, what's called the baseline period. So basically, if we start a project today, we're going back in time 5 years. We measure our emissions. So that's going to be, if you're livestock, it's going to be your methane predominantly. And depending on how intensive your system is, it might be some inputs and energy as well. And in a farming system, it's mostly going to be your energy, so your fuel and electricity, as well as any synthetic or natural inputs that you're using for nutrition and pest and disease management. So we measure that over 5 years, we average it out, and that gives you your baseline emissions. And then when we move forward, all of the carbon that we're storing on top of that is those emissions are already accounted for. I did see that Graham Anderson was in the room, so I don't know if, Graham, you wanted to jump in and add any words of wisdom, or where ACCU's up to in this kind of emissions accounting space, and how landholders can equip themselves to understand what can be a pretty complex topic.
Yeah, g'day, Dom. Hi, Christy and everyone. Yeah, I'll pop a couple of things in the chat just with regards to the AgVic emissions pilot, which is underway, doing 250 farms, doing all of that with the emissions audits and things. So there's a few bits here I'll pop in that chat, but I'll leave you to it. Thanks heaps, Dom.
Awesome. Thank you, Graham. So yeah, encourage people to begin to understand how this implicates our farming operation and what we can do to minimise emissions already. And if we're entering into a carbon project, then it's going to be an important obligation for us to meet, is to understand what our emissions are and then how we're going to account for them. This is a great little image, I find, because I find the inset offset kind of chaotic zone difficult to understand. And this is from Kakariki Capital, which is an organisation over in WA, and a really knowledgeable carbon farming expert put this together by the name of Lockie Ritchie. And this kind of maps out what is an offset and what's an inset. And so basically, insetting is dealing with emissions that are occurring inside our value chain. So if you think about beef cattle supply chain, you've got the farmer who's producing a live animal, and then you've got transport, and then you've got the processor who's actually selling that animal. And the way that this is headed is that land-based operations or farm operations are really the only ones that can actually deal with removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And so the supply chain is sort of asking us to participate or help them reduce emissions. And then offsetting is where we would trade or sell our ACCUs to other emitting sectors. So think coal, gas, mining, energy, the big kind of emitters who have a requirement to offset their emissions. Broadly speaking, carbon projects have what's called a crediting period and a permanence period. The crediting period is what it says it is. It's when you get credits. So 25 years is the period that you would be issued ACCUs, and the interval at which you get issued those ACCUs is somewhat up to you, and there's a minimum interval of 5 years in a soil carbon project. And the permanence period starts when you're issued your first ACCU. So if you issued your first ACCU at year 1, then the permanence period would start there and roll forward. If you issued your first ACCU at year 5, the permanence period would then start there. So it's important to acknowledge that there's a difference between the crediting period and the permanence period. Permanence means that you have to keep doing what you are doing for the period of the project. So in a soil carbon project, for example, if you have committed to a rotational grazing system, you got to keep doing that for the 25-year permanence period, really simply. Abatement, another one of these big words that gets bandied around, is really just the carbon sequestered less any increased emissions. So if we had gone into that kind of time-controlled or rotational grazing system, and as a result we were running more cattle, that would be this little black box here where we've actually generated a few more emissions, so we need to deal with those, and our abatement is everything that's left on top. The process is we pick a new and additional activity, we comply with a method which is regulated by the CER, and then we monitor, verify and report, and then woohoo, we get given some ACCUs, and then the fun begins because we have to decide what to do with them. So how might it work for you? I'm not exactly sure where everyone's dialed in from today, but I'm guessing that it's sort of southern parts of southwest Victoria and probably higher rainfall zones, but by and large across most of the eastern seaboard, these are probably the 3 most relevant carbon farming initiatives that I've come across. Happy to be corrected there, but the ones that we're going to talk about today. So we've got reforestation, plantation forestry, which is really timber and timber harvesting, and then soil carbon. And we'll focus on the soil carbon method mostly because that's what I know the most about, and I don't want to be talking too broadly about topics that I'm by no means an expert in, but I will give you a kind of broad brushstroke summary of how the other methods go. So before I do that, fundamentals, and this is where that due diligence piece becomes important, is, you know, having a sound existing business and a clear plan is really key before entering into a carbon project. So a lot of what we do as agribusiness advisors is sit down with farming families or communities and try and understand what's the long-term vision. So, you know, where are we headed, and do we have a sound and profitable business today, and how might this carbon farming opportunity complement the existing business? And I do like to think of it as a complement, because I think it should be the cream on top. And there are all sorts of production benefits that we're going to get out of entering into particularly a reforestation and a soil carbon project that will hopefully increase the viability of our agricultural enterprises. And that's an important part just to think through. And another quick one that I'd flag there is transition of either management or assets. So 25 years is a long time. And as we know, a lot of farming businesses are generational businesses. So what's the big picture? How is that transition of either management or assets or both going to be considered in the context of a long-term project? And it's just something to think through at the start in terms of how you structure it, what's the appropriate entity for the project to be held in, those sort of conversations. But yeah, I would encourage everyone who's sort of on the precipice of really exploring this to think about, well, where does it fit in my existing operation and business, and how might it complement it? Due diligence is key. As I said, you've got to understand the rules of the game before you decide to play. And you know, picking the right service provider and someone that you trust and want to have a long and fruitful and profitable relationship with is super important. Support from some key people, I think, in particular an accountant and a solicitor who can have a look at any contracts and also understand the tax implications of a carbon project is going to be super important. So, you know, it's like anything, you've just got to surround yourself with good, competent people who you trust, and move forward from there. So the reforestation by environmental or mallee plantings 2024 method is an updated methodology, and this is really about putting trees back on cleared agricultural land and setting aside that land for this reforestation. And these plantings remove carbon from the atmosphere over the 25 years or lifetime of the project. So yeah, pretty simple concept here. You plant trees and store CO2. It is a modelled methodology. So the full CAM method, for anyone that wants to, you know, go down a bit of a rabbit hole, you can go and look at how the full CAM method works. It's the full carbon accounting method, but it's basically a model of vegetative growth. And so trees, as they grow rapidly and then they plateau. So they're storing a lot of carbon in those sort of first years, and then they kind of plateau off. So both the reforestation method and the plantation method, you kind of front-ended with where you are generating ACCUs, and then there's a taper off. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there's also some wonderful benefits that come with planting trees on your property. And Christy, I'm sure you can jump in here with some wonderful anecdotes from your experience and in the agroforestry sector. But you know, this regulation of climates is only going to become more important. So providing that wind, shade, shelter, and we're also actually improving the small water cycle. We can improve soil health. So we've got these huge carbon pumps that we're putting into our ecosystem. They're sort of drawing down CO2, but they're also pumping carbon into our soil biological systems, and their associations with mycorrhizal fungi. again, it's just a fascinating space, and love talking about fungi and nerding out on trees, but definitely a strong advocate for trees in agroecosystems. And this is potentially a wonderful way for you to generate an income, as well as getting those productivity gains from your farm system. The plantation method is a little bit different in that it's really a timber for harvest. So think about, one is you're planting the forestry, sort of a permanent revegetation, and this is timber for harvest. Again, it's modelled, so you've got to establish a new plantation. There are also methods for converting an old plantation to a long rotation, but given that we're talking about farms, probably establishing a new one. Again, it's modelled, and key eligibility criteria is that you have to be in a 600 mil or above median rainfall zone. So you can kind of look up, you can jump online and look up. There's a great tool called Look-See, developed, I think, by the CSIRO. I might be wrong there, but hopefully right. And you can go and look at potential benefits or carbon accounting on your place. As I said before, the majority of the credits come in those early days, because that's when you've got the maximum growth of woody biomass, and this is an additional benefit to any timber income. At the moment, this method isn't really set up for small agroforestry systems, but I reckon that's where it's headed long term. So, this is potentially a wonderful opportunity to have a double whammy, where you've got a timber enterprise and you've also got a carbon enterprise that sits on top of that timber enterprise. Now the fun stuff, soil carbon, probably a little bit more complex than the other two methods, in that soil carbon is a measured methodology. So we're going and taking a series of soil cores. So if you think about your farm map, we decide an area that we want to work in, and then we go and take a whole chunk of cores and give us our baseline soil carbon level. And there's a lot of complex science that sits behind that estimation and how we go about it. But really what we're doing is we're trying to increase the amount of soil carbon in different fractions in our soil organic matter. And then we go and measure it again in, let's say, 5 years' time. That's the minimum, that's the maximum sampling interval. So you can only go as long as 5 years, and then you have to sample again. And the productivity benefits from soil carbon, hopefully don't have to go on too much about, but it's just phenomenal. If you think about carbon as that engine room of all life, then the more of it we can put in our soils, the more nutrient cycling we have, the more available nitrogen we have, the more available water we have. It's really just an absolute boon for an agricultural system. And I would go as far as to say that if putting more carbon in your soils isn't on your big picture goals, then it absolutely should be. Whether or not you're entering into a carbon project is kind of irrelevant to whether it's good for our landscapes. So the co-benefits here, I think, I touched on that, but that drought resilience piece is going to be massive moving forward. Increased pasture productivity, increased nutrient cycling. So, whenever I go into a farm system, one of the simplest tests you can do is to try and understand how much organic matter is in that soil. And as I said at the start of the show, there's been a massive loss out of our agricultural systems, and we just got to start to put some of it back. There's my rant for the day. But basically, what we've got to do is select a practice change. And so this is where that idea of something new, something different has to come in. So, a classic example is, here are the 12 activities that are eligible. So I've got stocking rate, so it's changing your grazing system. You might be adding nutrients, so there might be deficiency. You might be planting legumes, or you might be renovating or establishing a multi-species pasture. I won't go through all of them, but there's 12 available methodologies, and typically the projects that I've worked with today are livestock businesses, and we're looking at the intensification of the grazing system. So what we're doing there is we're really increasing the density and intensity of that grazing, and then also introducing a longer rest period to the grazing system. So you're getting that kind of pulse and release, which is shooting carbon down into the soil ecosystem as plants rapidly regrow, and we kick on the cycle from there. But the fundamentals of this are, this is kind of what RCS spends a lot of time teaching, is understanding how a regenerative grazing system works, and then beginning to implement that on your farm and having it registered as a practice change. So it has to be different to what you're already doing. So this example, we're putting in some extra fences and extra water points, and rotating the cattle around in a more intense way. Applying nutrients to the land. So often there might be a micronutrient constraint which is holding back productivity. Boron is a massive one, zinc is another massive one in a lot of Australian soils, and calcium, and particularly the ratio of calcium to magnesium is very important in carbon sequestration. But yeah, stuff like boron is hugely important. There's an emerging field of literature in this space, but this particular example is a carbon project where it was a cropping system, and we identified that there was a boron and zinc deficiency. Boron is one of the minerals that is massively important for the transfer of sugars from leaf to root. So if you think about how soils get their energy, it's that sunlight energy going through the leaf into the plant, into the root system. So in this instance, boron was missing. We add boron and we can really step on the gas for that carbon sequestration potential. Planting legumes in a pasture or cropping system, so available nitrogen and the balance of the carbon to nitrogen ratio is very important for carbon sequestration, or improving microbial diversity in systems, as well as improving productivity. As we know, we need nitrogen in the system to get production. So adding legumes to a pasture or crop rotation is a wonderful opportunity for us there. And here are some sequestration rates. This was a systemic literature review that Carbon Link did in the end of 2023. It gives you kind of the broad range, but if you just focus on grazing and the sort of 500 to 800 mil rainfall column there, you can see that an average sequestration rate might be 0.75 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year, and that's based on the best available literature. So what drives this? We've got rainfall and evaporation, so we need moisture in our system for plants to photosynthesize and drive this system. Soil type, clay content is good, but not too much, and soil depth. So soil depth is really important because we're trying to fill up a big bucket. So the deeper the soil profile, the bigger the bucket, the more carbon we can put in it. Temperature, so the temperate zone is better than more arid zones, and that's really related to rainfall and evaporation. But management is the biggest driver of sequestration. So how can we change the management of our farm system to generate a more healthy soil system? And really that's what RCS is all about, and what we've been banging on about for about 40 odd years now. And I'd love to talk to people about what's the first incremental step that you can make in your system today to improve soil health, and soil health is always going to be strongly correlated to soil organic carbon. So think about it like filling up a bucket. How big's the bucket? How full it already is, and how leaky is it? So how much carbon's going out of our system? And then how do we manage that over time? So the science of soil carbon sequestration is, there's a new paper about every month on the contentious nature of how much carbon we can put in our soils. But fundamentally, it comes back to how well we're managing our soil ecosystem. And there's an added bonus here, which is that 1 tonne of soil organic carbon is equivalent to 3.67 tonnes of CO2e. So it's a pretty handy little multiplier if we're thinking about putting a tonne of carbon in per hectare in our soil each year. So let's say 5 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. Yes, so that would be 5 tonnes of CO2e. And then you multiply that over 5 years and you're starting to generate a pretty handy amount of ACCUs. And these are some results from Queensland. So apologies that it is from a northern context, and there are slightly different dynamics in the south, and scale is a consideration. But the sequestration rate for those, this is from 5 projects, about 5,500 hectares of project area. And the average sequestration rate over a 5-year period from 2018 to 2022 was 1.57 tonne per hectare per year. So yielding 5.75 ACCUs per hectare per year, so about 25 ACCUs over a 5-year period per hectare. And then we've got to multiply that by the value of an ACCU. So it's a pretty sizable sum of money when we do those sums, about $200 a hectare over that period. And that is as far as I'll go. Sort of would love to do a deep dive on soil carbon and how we can put more of it in our agro ecosystems, but let's hopefully have a bit of a yarn about what I've covered, and I'm sure people have questions. Hopefully, maybe Christy will razz up the crowd. And
that was great. We've got a question from Ali. Do you want to just unmute yourself? And
Sure. Can you hear me now?
yes,
yeah,
thank you.
Got you, Ali.
So, John, we've got a really small farm, so it's 50 acres.
Yeah.
So where does all this fit in for a small farm like ours?
Yeah, great question, Ali. At the moment, scale is a big constraint for all of the methods that I outlined, but I think the opportunity there is then in collaboration. So, you know, how can you get together with other landholders in your catchment, in your district, in your valley, and begin to think about a collaborative project? Because the constraint with scale at the moment is really, it's kind of that cost-benefit ratio. The costs of establishing a project at 50 acres, it's just too expensive right now for it to be economically viable. I'm in a similar boat. We're sort of 300 acres and it's just not quite big enough. So beginning to explore how we might put together a group of landholders to have a collaborative project. There's a project in Gippsland with the reforestation method where I think it's 7 or 8 landholders put together 200 hectares and that was a viable chunk of country that they could then establish a project on where it made sense. So we've got to get creative is the answer.
I just wonder how the 25-year requirement might go with that kind of collaborative project.
Working with people, it's tricky, isn't it?
Well, because you've got so many different, you know, if you've got a collective, it's a great, I agree, but obviously there are going to be differences over a period of time, like 25 years, that will make that collective quite tricky.
Absolutely. And I think in that instance, you're probably thinking more about those tree-based methods where you're getting the bulk of the benefit in the first, let's say, 5 to 8 years. Okay. And then it's really about letting the trees stabilise and be on property for the next chunk of time.
Yeah.
Soil's probably a bit more complex because you've got changing management, changing land management practices, and all of the fun of trying to get people to work together.
Indeed. Thank you.
No worries, Alan. Thanks for the question.
Okay, we've got a question from Nick. Nick, do you just want to unmute yourself?
Yep. Dom, thanks for your presentation and Christy, thanks for the session. Just in terms of, you had a graph up there with crediting period, and then you talked about 5 to 7 years of baselining.
Yeah.
If someone's really keen to go ahead and they've got all the facts and figures, the results for soil tests, they know how many animals are on their property over that period of time and what left, what came in, and, you know, their fuel, fertilizer usage and everything like that. Is it possible to start a project, you know, sort of straight away if they've got all that data?
Yeah, great question, Nick. I'll just talk in sort of broad ballparks because I can only speak to my experience with the soil carbon side of things. But roughly speaking, if you've got all of that data and you wanted to start today, there's probably, I'm going to say, between 3 to 6 months of process to go through with the Clean Energy Regulator to get that project set up and then get it registered. And then there's probably another, let's say, 3 to 6 months of getting to what's called project registration. So let's say you start today, you're probably up and running in 12 months.
Thanks, Dom.
Yeah, and obviously having all of that data is going to expedite that process. So, you know, it's wonderful if you've got all of those records intact and you've got your livestock numbers and emissions numbers all neat and tidy. That's going to make the whole process a lot quicker.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick.
Any other questions? Graham, did you want to jump in and add anything there?
No, just good session, Dom and Christy, and totally agree. There's so much good reasons to get soil carbon and more carbon back in our landscapes and stuff, and just the challenge of how best to do it. Dom, I know you've worked all over the country and stuff. Any observations around Victoria? Because there's certainly been a lot less activity with regards to carbon projects, and I think you've raised a main one, which is the scale. Like you need, you know, the larger properties of further north. You know, it makes it a lot easier. But also just wondering your thoughts about. There's probably a bit of a longer history here of more intensive grazing operations in terms of the setting up for the rotational stuff and stuff. Any observations there when you travel around?
Yeah, so there's probably one consideration. Thanks for the question, Graham. That's awesome. One consideration is definitely scale. So the more land area you have, the more area you have to make a difference. So if you think about it in terms of filling up that bucket, you've just got a bigger bucket, and a smaller change across a big area adds up to a lot. Whereas in Victoria, what we're faced with is a lot of smaller properties. But as the science and technology of the measurement evolves, I think that cost of measurement's going to really come down. So Farm Lab's a great example of where building sort of combining soil sampling with machine learning and remote sensed data, we can begin to really drive down the cost of resampling. So I think that's where there's a lot of potential for just bringing down the cost and therefore bringing down the required scale of actually doing a project, I hope. In terms of the grazing management, I think that's a much bigger can of worms. But I would say, I reckon the biggest difference is in lots of our improved, or say improved pasture systems, they're very intensive systems, and I think it's a bigger strategic and mindset shift to actually change the whole landscape management plan in a more intensive system, because you've got to actually begin to move, let's say, for example, away from an annual based system and towards a perennial based system, which is a big shift, right? It's we're sort of hooked into this high production, high input systems in large parts of Victoria, and so I think by and large that's probably where the difference lies. It's actually not in whether we can put carbon back in the soil. I'm fairly confident that we can, and actually in a lot of Victorian soils, you know, the fundamentals of the soils are really, really good. It's just that we've managed them quite poorly for a longer period of time. But to actually turn that ship around, I think is hugely hopeful and hugely possible. But it's this kind of paddock between the ears that needs to shift, and there's probably just more thinking through, well, how are we going to transition the economic engine of our enterprise to a new and different system? Yeah. Does that answer your question, Graham? I know it's probably not, but hopefully in some way.
That's good. Thanks, Dom. Yeah.
Got a question here from Michelle, and then I'll circle back to you, Nick. Hi, Michelle. Nice to have you here. Have there been any ACCU Landcare projects with multiple properties participating in, say, a biolink that includes revegetation? And also, if there's any Landcare crew here that want to speak up on this topic, please do.
Yeah, please do, because don't know.
Yeah.
Don't know, can't say. I did hear the other day of one that was, yeah, like I said, a collaborative project, but whether or not it was a Landcare collaboration, my gut instinct would say that it probably was a group of active Landcare members who were getting together and doing that kind of revegetation at scale, because that's what Landcare is fantastic at doing. So that'll be my gut, but I actually don't know.
Graham, have you got any intel on that?
I think most people are really keen on teaming up, and as you're saying, like Landcare, you know, and you know, your local Landcare work down that way with Yanyangert Creek and stuff has done extraordinary stuff teaming up. I just do have a story. Back in 2003, 2006, we ran a Plantations for Greenhouse program, and that had individual carbon rights agreements with farmers. And obviously the same thing happened there, that, you know, once people were presented with a legal agreement, the size of the check became important about, is this big enough to really enter in a long-term agreement? And we had quite a few people saying, we want to team up with their neighbours to get to the minimum scale. And it all worked in practice. But when it came to signing the contracts, once the contracts hit everyone's kitchen table, all of the smaller ones just said, you know what, we're going to plant the trees anyway, but we don't really want to enter into a 25-year agreement. So to me, that was sort of the litmus test about when you come to sign a legal agreement, that's when actually, how much are we getting? How much is this worth to the farm? Like how many zeros are on the check? That really determined how many people went through and signed, and all of the collaborative ones, that most of them went along to do it, the smaller ones, but they did it via other means, and it fell over because of the long-term contract. Yeah. So, and I'm not sure, Dom, if you've, you know, what's any insights to share about what, is it very onerous, the contract that's associated with an ACCU project?
I think the contractual obligations can be scary, but I think Nick kind of outlined what is required in terms of having the data available. That's probably, to me, that would be the bit that's perhaps onerous if you haven't already got those numbers on hand. The contract itself, I think, you know, it's a job for getting it reviewed and making sure that you're comfortable with the terms, but it's not anything particularly onerous. It's you're agreeing to do what you say you were going to do for the period that you said you were going to do it. So I think it's that contracts in general scare people, and as you say, Graham, as soon as you start seeing a legal document, then zeros become important, and that's just a psychological hurdle that we all need to get over.
Great, thank you. We've just clicked over to 1 o'clock, so I think we better honour our time commitment. So sorry, Nick, that I didn't get to your question, but if you want to send that through to me on an email, I'll see if I can follow up. And any other questions people have, just send through. I'll send out an email after this with the links that were put out on the chat. But thank you very much, Don, for your time, and everyone else, Graham, and everyone that's attended. And yeah, we'll hope to be putting on more of this sort of information. The CCMA, Corangamite Catchment Management Authority, is starting to do a whole heap of information sessions and education around carbon. So just keep an eye out for all those things that are coming out in the coming future.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Christy and Sarah. It's been wonderful. And thanks everyone for coming. Please, I'll get Christy to share my email and just shoot me a note if you've got a specific question. I'm happy to do my best at answering it or pointing you in the right direction to someone who can.
Yeah. And also thanks, Sarah, for supporting with the webinar. It's been great. Extra tech support. Sarah's with the CCMA, so also another person to chat to about this stuff. All right. Hope everyone has a good afternoon.
Thanks all.
Thanks, you too. Bye.